we are going to invite onto the stage three more contributors. That is Ken Coates, who is a professor at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada, who is an expert on Indigenous peoples and communities. Geir Henning Wintervold, who is the administrative director of Finnfjord, which is a producer of industrial materials involved in steel production in Finland, and Erlen Bulfag, who is the Dean of the Business School at Nord University. So give all three of our newcomers a big hand. Thank you very much. Right, so we want to get you three involved straight away. Erlen, I'll start with you. This question of the power of knowledge, I want now to bring it down to the level of communities and what it means for people in the north, in the Arctic region. When we talk about a smart Arctic, do you think communities are being properly equipped to be part of, the sort of information economy, this age of the internet we live in? Are northern communities being properly prepared and equipped to be full participants?
It's quite easy to answer that. The answer is no, and in many ways we lack we have the road initiatives and we have the schools and education initiatives, but the initiative to make us a connected community is not in the same speed. So, and this reduces the ability for safety and health response, and it reduces our ability to communicate efficiently with these areas. And this is something which should be very much addressed, and it also reduces the ability to have larger companies and companies depending on quick communication on digital framework. So in many ways we are not there yet, but very many positive things are happening on that side. But it's a long way.
Right, so where do you see the biggest problems lying right now in terms of getting the people of the North fully integrated into a sort of information economy and a 21st century digital economy?
Globally, there is an initiative to build fiber cables who connects the world to every corner of the world. None of them passes currently in the Arctic, in the most populated part of the Arctic, which happens to be the Scandinavian and Russian side. This should be fixed in some way. We also have the opportunity for being the capital for data storage and also big data and artificial intelligence, since we have a cold climate and produce need less energy for this. But all this.
You mean you want great big sort of shed full of servers and electronic hanging over the Arctic region?
Yeah, it's a marvelous opportunities because it can be fed by renewable energy here. And it can also be supporting the fish farming industry and other new industries coming in a big way because you attract talent.
Another thing you just began to mention to me earlier, which I want you to tease out a little bit. You said there's something of a sort of crisis in educational terms in the far north, because there's a real gender imbalance as to who is being educated and to the highest levels, and it's very much a sort of gender imbalance issue. Explain that to me. I don't quite get it.
We produce a report called Business Index North who analyzed this, and one of the findings is quite astonishing, is that on all age levels, female participation in higher education and also in research is much higher than the male proportion. And this is on all levels of education. After the basic education, this happens. And the effect is that more females move away, and the definition of population growth is the number of mothers. So we have an inherent problem with creating enough children to sustain the society.
Young women, or girls and young women, are more inclined to go away to get higher education, and they often don't come back. But why aren't the boys going out to get higher education too?
Because they are not competitive in the work area. And the work we supply for higher educated people are centralized, very much skewed to the south. As in many countries, and this we should be frank about, because imagine what happens if we cannot excel on our resources here, since they are here, because we have no talent and no strategy for this. So this should be fixed, and the capacity to create sustainable business is too low.
All right. Well, thanks for that. And there's a lot to tease out from that. But let's just get our other new speakers involved as well. Yeah, if I can turn to you. First of all, you're going to have to forgive me. I don't entirely know what Finnfjord does, but it's quite heavy industrial, right?
Yeah.
What? Explain.
It's like a definition of heavy industry. Like we emit around 300,000 tons of CO2. We're the 13th biggest emitter of CO2 in land-based industry in Norway.
You're saying that with a smile, but
yeah, well,
we're now viewing you as the baddie on the panel. So,
yeah, well,
given that this is all about smart Arctic and the power of knowledge, we should be wanting you to close down immediately, shouldn't we?
Well, then you're doing a big mistake.
Well, explain then. How can you explain to us all? I mean, I can understand you provide jobs. You are obviously an important player in the local economy, but in the widest sense, explain to me how you are a point of value and public good.
That depends on the view you're taking, of course. But if you can postulate that the world needs steel, it cannot survive without steel, then the question is how to make steel in the best environmental way.
Yeah.
And steel is a commodity. It's made what we make is ferrosilicon, which is then afterwards used in the steel industry. And ferrosilicon I think, is one of the most heavy of the heavy industries. Like we use in the Finnfjord is located at Finnsnes, 2 hours away from here. We use 2% of Norway's hydroelectric production. We have 300,000 tons of CO2.
Oh my God! I feel I owe you an apology. I think I assumed that you were Finnish. Are you not a Finnish company?
No, we are just.
So I make a public apology. I think I implied you were Finnish, and you're certainly not. But anyway, getting over my embarrassment. Yeah.
But if you just look at the numbers, well, shut us down immediately because there's a huge emission here. But then you have to use your knowledge and understand how are we compared with the other producers. Ferrosilicon is a commodity that can be produced no matter where in the world, and it can be easily transported. So the question is not shutting down all the factories that we have in Europe, because they will pop up again, in China, in Kazakhstan, wherever. And the emissions that we have from producing it there is 5 times the emission that we have per ton of ferrosilicon.
Right.
But being in Norway is the public expects us to do more. So the mentality in the industry has shifted from just increasing volume to trying to produce what we do in a more sustainable way. And if you look at the history of Finnfjord, we have been producing ferrosilicon for 60 years soon. Our focus has shifted a lot from just replicating what we're doing and instead trying to find new ways of producing with a less environmental impact. So we have invested 1 billion Norwegian kroners in Norway's biggest energy recovery system. Where the CO2 impact is around 90% of what we actually emit of CO2. We have a project now with the University of Tromsø, which will actually involve science from the marine department in actually using microalgae as an agent for actually capturing the CO2 from our emissions.
Really?
And that algae might, and again, be a good food source for the salmon industry. So by one initiative there, we will solve 2 big problems.
The really interesting thing there is the degree to which you are now collaborating, cooperating, working absolutely alongside academics, scientists, researchers. So is that new? I mean,
well, there's a huge shift in Norwegian industry. We need to use knowledge in order to reduce the footprint of what we're actually doing. And it's more it's close to a competition. Because we understand that if we have the letter of for us to operate, we need to have the consent of the political establishment, but also the people that lives close to us. We cannot be just doing what we have done before, because people in Norway, they expect us to be the cleanest in the world of what we're doing.
Yeah.
The problem is that it's extremely capital intensive. So somebody needs to be able to fund all the investments that we're doing.
My question is given your commitment to doing things responsibly and to working with the science community to find new ways, albeit very expensive ways, of improving your sort of sustainability, how can you compete on the most raw, basic cost level with, as you refer to these rivals in China, Kazakhstan, and wherever? I mean, how come you can stay in the marketplace?
We need to focus on environmental investments that actually is profitable, and those are difficult to find. And also you're taking a huge risk, so the reward should also then be huge. Like when we invested in 2013 in the energy recovery system, it was 1 billion Norwegian kroner, and we're a family-owned company, so that was a lot of money for us. It took us around 5 years to make it stable, and it almost killed us because there's nobody interested in actually supporting a business that's actually losing money, even though that business is environmentally very, very efficient. So you need to find ways of how to mitigate that risk-taking. Either you can do that with providing programs that can actually enable us to do a lot of research, and also other programs that will enable us to do those huge investments that we're talking about.
How's it going right now?
Well, we have just opened the world's largest algae tank by far. It's going actually quite well. The biology is working, so the algae are eating CO2 every day. The big issues now is just to try to industrialize it. We are at stage 4 in a stage 5 development program. At stage 3, we have quite big tanks, but then we use a lot of manual work to try to harvest all the algae. Now we're back to try to industrialize it, because we're going from 300,000 liter tanks to 3 million liter tanks.
Wow.
And then you can't be like using manual labor, then you have to have machines doing that.
Yeah.
So
well, in my love of case studies and specific examples, that's a great example of the power of knowledge being utilized by a business.
And also like the silo thinking that we were discussing earlier, like you're using actually knowledge from the marine scientists with knowledge from industrialists like us, and like the combination of those two has been fantastic.
Yeah.
If you came to me 5 years ago and suggested that marine biologists should be able to solve the CO2 issues from our process, because our process, they emit a lot of stuff, I would say, well, no way, it can't be.
Just bringing it back to some of the issues we were talking about earlier about the nature of knowledge and who is participating in this sort of knowledge field. You're in the north, you say your big operation is not so very far from here. To what extent are you working with indigenous communities, providing them with jobs, using their skills and know-how as part of your operations?
It's like you said, well, there's no difference between indigenous people and local people, because we have a lot of indigenous people working there, but we treat them as local people. So I don't see like a huge difference in like treating indigenous people differently than the local people, because we need to make sure that everyone has equal value.
Yeah. Is that what you want to hear?
Well, actually, I think
Ani?
it's that's an important statement. I think there are two things that I wanted to say. Is that what you're talking about in terms of being environmentally responsible and the exposure and the risk. This is an important use of knowledge and a precedent for steel industry elsewhere, and to set the highest standards and the benchmark in this regard that is important for indigenous peoples. I would say that the treatment of individual indigenous persons and jobs and opportunities, which are certainly needed. I think there's, in addition to that, a critical need for recognizing the impacts that your industry or any industry happens to have on indigenous communities in terms of the environment, all of the interrelated elements that they rely upon within their communities to sustain their communities. I think there's a responsibility, a corporate responsibility, an industry responsibility to indigenous peoples. There are important standards that should be looked at, and it's probably something that your board and others are familiar with in terms of, for example, the guiding principles on business and human rights and the importance of the international human rights standards. So I would challenge you to, inform yourselves about these standards and to think carefully about, as our colleague here has mentioned, integrating the perspectives and the views of Indigenous peoples and the indirect and the direct impacts that may in fact take place. But what you're talking about in terms of the industry is also a message of political will at the highest level to look at the smartest approach, the best approach for not only the industry but for society, for everybody.
Well, let's talk about peoples and communities across the north. Ken, you're based in Canada, but I know that you've actually worked all over the world on Indigenous sort of issues, including in New Zealand, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, in remote regions and northern, there's not as much of a gap as we think there is.
No, indeed. So this whole debate is really about making people and their communities as best equipped as possible for this 21st century world of ours, where information flows are 24/7, they're immediate. We live in a digital age where, the proposition is that knowledge is power. How do you best equip, in your view, often isolated and often Indigenous communities with the ability to thrive in this environment?
Huge question. A big part of the challenge actually is recognizing the problems associated with this 21st century. A lot of the language around things like smart cities and smart societies and smart countries is actually very naive. A lot of these smart things are actually going to destroy and undermine communities. We're seeing that happening now. We're seeing big work employment losses in the mining sector as companies bring in automated vehicles, for example. We're seeing the destruction of small town stores because people are using e-shopping. We're seeing banks being removed from small communities because they have e-banking, right? And so the idea that everything's going to be smart doesn't mean it's going to be favorable. And so you have an interesting situation. I think our biggest challenge is starting off by acknowledging the problem. I think I'd agree with you completely. We have an innovation gap. And the North is actually falling further behind rather than catching up. Southern areas are racing ahead. We're spending billions of dollars in wiring up the fast cities and bringing in all sorts of new technologies. Every year, northern remote communities, Indigenous communities fall further behind.
But that runs counter to intuition in a way, because you'd think the internet and the digital age would sort of close the gap. You're saying it sort of enhances the gap.
If you look at northern Canada, and I think you see the same thing here, the internet is 10 years behind, 5 years behind. It's useless. What's happening is all the cities are putting on super fast technologies that are medical, things you can do in the medical technologies would help these communities immensely. You can't use them because in fact the internet is actually not good enough. Sometimes if you I'll use a really good example, you like concrete examples.
I do.
If you bring in new technologies to sort of judge about diabetes. Diabetes is a scourge in northern Canada. Indigenous peoples are dying by it in huge numbers, right? We have technologies that you can walk into a room, put your hand on something like an iPad, it'll do an instant sort of evaluation of your diabetes. That's a great thing. All of a sudden you've got preventative care, you can get more intervention at the right times, it can be really, really helpful. You know one of the impacts of that? The airlines that serve these small communities that are essential lifelines rely on medical evacuations to cover the bills. Some of those airlines have 40 to 50% of their money comes from medical evacuations.
Right.
If people are healthier, you don't need the planes.
Right.
And if you don't have the planes, all of a sudden you've lost a huge lifeline.
Yeah.
Right? And that's not a good thing. So you're going to deny diabetes care? Of course not. But the other problem is we have got huge educational deficits in northern Canada in particular. They are so massive we should be as a country embarrassed to sort of identify the fact that these northern communities often have 25% high school graduation rates. And in a high-tech and scientific society, you need more education, more people with advanced learning. We can do it if we have the right internet connectivity, but we're not doing it, and the innovation gap is getting wider and wider, and we should be really worried about that.
What a depressing picture.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. But I also think that a major contributing factor is what Ailey Cascatello said earlier in the first panel, and that is the right to determine your own priorities for development within communities and the right to self-determination, for them to decide, especially when you when your comment, especially about education and standards for education, and when I talk about indigenous knowledge, too often what we've seen are educational institutions imposed by the South, imposed by the colonizers, and not specifically those institutions being established, created for, and controlled by indigenous peoples themselves and their own particular standards, especially when it comes to indigenous knowledge, retention of language, retention of culture and cultural integrity of the communities. So it's a two-edged sword. There are some advantages, there are some disadvantages. You're right to point out that infrastructure, for example, and I think Senator Murkowski was talking about this early on, that the lack of infrastructure that exists, and those who have internet, those who have not, certainly the cost of internet itself. Things are changing and improving, but there are advantages and disadvantages, and really it depends upon the indigenous peoples themselves to determine. I mean, they're the ultimate arbitrators as to whether or not these things have been advantageous or they're suffering from the disadvantages.
Let's take views and questions from the audience again. We've got just a few minutes left before we all break for lunch, so let's just try to see if we can get some more questions. If you have questions or thoughts for this panel on the whole notion of enhancing the smartness of the North and empowering people to be part of the sort of 21st century digital economy. You, ma'am, yeah?
Hi. Just quite provocative questions. The title of this panel is The Power of Knowledge. But I don't think, I think in this moment we see how much, very strongly, that knowledge doesn't have really a strong power, since the scientists said that there's climate change, since the science advised politicians and the people that climate change is a threat, and the situation is collapsing. They were not able to find an agreement even. So does knowledge really have power in this context, and what we can do to really give power to knowledge, because at this moment it's just an instrument to get more power, knowledge.
It's a fair question. I mean, if the biggest challenge facing us as a species is the warming of our planet, and you know, the way in which we as a species are responsible for that and seem unable to take the actions necessary to control it, then the fact that we have the knowledge isn't giving us power. It isn't actually being delivered in terms of changed policies and better behaviors.
There's no easy solution on that, because in a way power in a democracy is democracy. It's sort of deliberative democracy, and I think what was mentioned earlier on in the panel is that scientists, researchers need to engage in the deliberative processes in society to make their voice heard. And media has a role to not skew the picture.
We talked about that, yeah.
And the challenge is in a way that scientists, because in science nothing is true. It's the level of certainty, and of course engaging in that sort of atmosphere when others are very cocksure on this is right, that's difficult, because in a way scientists can never say this is right, but they can engage much more and actually be stronger in society, and I think that's important.
Yeah, you mean scientists need to discover their inner Donald Trump, just in terms of the way they...
Not all the way.
I don't mean
half the way.
I don't mean intellectually, I just mean in the way they are more adamant, they are more aggressive about would that be fair? They need to be a little more out there in terms of the way they deliver their message.
But still preserving the issue that there will always be uncertainty, and also the point that this is a democracy. Deliberative processes need to decide.
All right. Dilly, forgive me. We'll just try and squeeze. If we've got one more, I think we've got one more, and then we're going to have to break for lunch.
My name is Ottar Uppsal. I'm the deputy leader of Troms County Youth Council. I have to say, we're speaking about the power of knowledge. I'm really grateful to be here, but I speak for the general youth when I say the youth does not know enough about climate change. We go to school, we learn climate change is bad, then we go home and play video games. We don't know the consequences. So I speak for my friends, my future children, and our planet when I ask, how will you educate us? Because this is not working.
Yeah, well, it's a great and profound question. I don't know if we can solve it before lunch. But who would like to give us some thoughts on that before we break for lunch?
As a representative for the educators here, you should come to my classes, because sustainability is a big issue. Not even in the marketing topics we teach sustainability. But there's actually a large opportunity just ahead of us, because the rise of the knowledge of the climate change has made a huge influx of research money. We should have an equally large interest in social science and in business in parallel, and that will greatly help companies like Finnfjord and companies in this area to excel and change their businesses and be sustainable. And we should also equally hard educate Europe and other parts of the world that what happens in the Arctic is not caused by us, but by what happens in the countries outside.
Sure.
So when they start the SUV, they should maybe turn it off again.
Yeah.
But I mean, a final thought, and I'm going to go back to you, John. I felt a certain amount of fatalism in you when you said, you know, in the end, this is about the way our democracy works. In the end, it's about us all as human beings. You know, we are flawed people, and we might hear in our classrooms that climate change is bad, and we've all got to take responsibility. We've got to live our lives in different ways. But when we then go out into the world and live our lives, we don't necessarily follow through, and I don't know how that ever changes.
Full of positive examples. I like to listen to the example of Finnfjord, how in a way it's a public-private partnership, your transition, because there is a partnership between the company and the regional university developing this completely new ideas. It's public funds that are supporting, but of course you are making most of the funding in it. The point is that we need to show these positive examples and demonstrate that they are working. And actually the role of the state, the role of the public in that transition is really, really important, because you cannot compete tomorrow in the marketplace with this, but you can compete in 10 years. So actually making that transition happen is really important.
It comes back always, doesn't it, to all of the different stakeholders need to be involved, from the politicians to the businesses, the scientists, the academics, the journalists.
The indigenous peoples.
The indigenous peoples, thank you very much. Yeah, it is about all of us as individuals, in our groups, and as a collective society. And with that thought, profound or not, I think we have to bring this conversation to a close. But it's been a pleasure having you all on the panel. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for lunch. See you soon. But please give our panel a very warm thank you. Thank you very much.